Hey, welcome to The Perspective. Mike Sherbino here. Really glad you've joined us today because we're going to talk about a subject that you might not be aware of yet, but I know that it's critical to your well-being, emotional, spiritual, and physical. I want to talk about the resurrection. Did it really happen? Is it really true? Can we actually believe that Jesus died and that he rose again? And if he did, what difference does it make? Well, here to help me again is a guest who's been on our program once before, but delighted he's live in the studio, and that's Abdu Murray. Abdu, welcome, man.
Great to be
Glad you're here.
Mike.
That's a dumb line, live in the studio. It's better than dead.
Yeah.
Unless you believe in the resurrection.
In which case it could be undead and not zombie-like, though.
Not
We
zombie.
don't believe in zombies. We believe in resurrected bodies. Yes, indeed.
Abdu, you've had an amazing journey through life. And on the first program, you shared a little bit about your story of faith. I wonder if you could just recap it briefly. So just to give us some context before we talk about the resurrection,
Sure.
because you love talking about what for many people would be considered a difficult subject.
Yeah, well, I like talking about a lot of difficult subjects. In fact, that's why it got me in trouble, actually, quite a bit in conversations. I was raised as a Muslim, and I liked having very hard conversations, especially about faith and about ultimate reality. And I was typically engaging with Christians because Christians were low-hanging fruit when I was growing up. You know, I grew up in the 80s, and I'm a child of the 70s. I grew up in the 80s, so I remember the 80s far more. 80s and 90s, I was spending a lot of time with Christians because back then it was fashionable to say you were a Christian even if you didn't mean it, or if you didn't really have a commitment. I was a Muslim, and you meant it if you said you were a Muslim. So I thought Christians meant it too. So I would engage in these conversations with them about, why do you believe that stuff? Why do you believe the Bible is God's word? This whole Trinitarian idea. If God is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, that sounds like three gods. Aren't you just a confused tritheist? This God who is truly great gets trapped in a body that sweats, needs to eat, falls asleep, and then dies at the hands of the very sinners.
Okay, hold it. You just raised subject matter for about 5 more shows.
Yeah, well, but ultimately what I'm getting at, though, is that as I thought these things were like terrible ideas, I began to really explore those ideas. And the resurrection, which we're talking about today, featured prominently. The historical evidence for the resurrection featured prominently in my coming to faith. For two reasons. One is that the resurrection in the Christian faith is both a sword and a shield. It's a sword in the sense that every worldview that denies it, and Islam denies it, every worldview that denies the resurrection, if the resurrection is true, is therefore proven false because it denies the central fact of history. But it's also a shield in that the sense that the Christian faith is bulwarked by and defended by the central claim, which is that Jesus died for our sins. He died to pay the price for our sins. And if he died and stayed dead, we'd have no idea if he was right. But he didn't die and stay dead. He died and then rose from the dead to prove he was right. So it's both a sword and a shield. When I realized that, my worldview changed from Islam to Christianity.
But it didn't happen overnight. It was gradual.
Yeah, it was 9 years.
9 years.
It took 9 years. And I say it this way often, is that it didn't take 9 years to find sufficient answers to become a Christian. I found enough answers to become a Christian, not comprehensive answers. I still don't have all the answers, but I found enough answers to justify becoming a Christian within 2 years. But it took 7 more years to wrestle with the consequences of those answers. What would it mean if I became a Christian in terms of community, family, my identity, who I was?
Well, especially as a Muslim person. I mean, oh my goodness.
Well, and
Were you ostracized?
it wasn't a party. I didn't get like parties thrown for me when I became a Christian. But I'll tell you, I'm blessed with, it's still blessed with a very, very close, powerfully loyal and deep, abiding family relationships. And it was rough. You can imagine. I mean, think about this. If you're a Christian and you're watching this, and your son walks up to you and says, "Oh, by the way, I'm a Buddhist now." Think about the upheaval in your family, right?
Yeah.
So we had a similar upheaval, naturally so, understandably so, but we're a strong family. There were community consequences and other consequences as well. But the biggest one for me personally wasn't just the relational consequences, as impactful as those were, but because of the strength of the family, we were able to maintain those relationships. For me, it was identity. I liked being a Muslim. I liked being religious. I liked being a little bit more pious and holier than thou than the other person.
So were you going to the mosque regularly saying the prayers?
Oh yeah, well, I was having Mosque attendance, because of the distance of the mosque from where we lived, was a little tougher, but I was committed. I was very committed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we could spend a lot of time there, but we want to jump ahead. And as that is a backdrop, I want to talk about the resurrection. Did it happen? Let's just start with that. Did it happen?
Yeah, and this is one of these things where I often say that you can believe in the resurrection not just as a mere matter of hope, but as a fact of history. Not just hope, it's actual history, but it's hope that's based on history. So the short answer is yes, it did happen. And we have incredibly good evidence for the resurrection on multiple fronts. And as someone who's trained as a lawyer, I spent 17 years as a trial lawyer. I'm still licensed as an attorney. I understand how evidence works and how eyewitness testimony actually works. And when you look at the documents and the history behind and surrounding those documents, both the biblical record and also the extra biblical record, the record of things that were contemporaneous to the Bible at the time of Jesus, that were outside of the Bible but corroborate the Bible and its testimony, you see a really good case that can be made for the resurrection. In fact, what I often do when I talk about the resurrection is, if I give my closing statements to the jury, I'll often put it in an acronym. And it's CASE. A good friend of mine, Mickey Badalamenti, who's also a wonderful apologist, he and I came up with this acronym for the 4 pieces of evidence that comprise the case for the resurrection of Jesus, which is the acronym CASE, C-A-S-E.
What's C?
So C is crucifixion, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Of course, this is a prerequisite. You can't have a resurrection without a death first. That's kind of how those things work. And the reason why you have to prove the crucifixion is not because history is challenged by this, but because, for example, the religion of my birth, Islam actually denies that Jesus died on a cross. The Quran says that they did not kill him, nor was he crucified, but it looked like it to them. They think there's a substitute on the cross.
Pretty hard, eh?
Yeah. So you have to prove that it actually happened. Now, the good news is the evidence is overwhelming. I mean, no one really doubts on historical grounds that Jesus died by crucifixion under Roman.
When you say no one, who do you mean?
Look like Bart Ehrman, for example. Bart Ehrman is a extremely hostile skeptic of the Christian faith, and he says, "Look, Jesus died by crucifixion under the Romans. There is no doubting this. He died that way, and this is no friend of the Christian faith."
Okay.
Him and other people, Paula Fredrickson, another good example of these historians.
So there's good proof.
Oh, there's excellent proof.
Let's go on to A.
Yeah, so A is the appearances of Jesus alive after his death to the disciples. Now, this one is a powerful one because what the evidence shows, both their own testimony of the disciples themselves and the corroborating testimony of the disciples, and then the enemies of the Christian faith, like Cornelius Tacitus and Josephus and Suetonius and Marabar Serapion. These are all either Jewish or Roman historians who are hostile to the Christian faith, who say the disciples saw something that they believed was the risen Jesus. They were so convicted of it that they're willing to die for it. Now, this is important because
That's worth something.
it is. It's actually worth quite a bit because oftentimes we'll say, well, people died for lies all the time. The Nazis died for a lie. The terrorists who flew into the Twin Towers died for a lie. What's the big deal? But this is the difference. Those people died believing something that someone else convinced them was true. The disciples were willing to die, and some in fact did die, for a lie that they knew was false because they didn't claim, "Thus and so told me." They said, "I saw it." So they would have to have denied something. They would have to have lied about something that they knew was false and were willing to die for it for no personal gain whatsoever. That's why Paula Fredrickson and others would say the disciples had some kind of experience that convinced them Jesus was alive. The other part in the S, which was similar to the appearances, so the C, the A, and the S, is the skeptics converted.
Skeptics. Okay, who are they?
So the 2 skeptics, one is James. James wasn't a big fan of Jesus, kind of thought maybe he's a little bit off his rocker, not so thrilled about his Messiah claims and all these things. Well, he becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church based on the belief that Jesus rose from the dead.
So powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I tell you this as a trial lawyer, if you have a witness on the stand who was once hostile to you, and that person changes their mind and then gets on the stand and testifies in a way that hurts them but helps your case, You leave that witness on the stand and let him sing his song all together, all day.
Leave him there all day.
So we have James, but we have even better than that. We have Paul. Paul was a self-admitted persecutor of the church who changed his entire mind based on having said, I saw him with my own eyes.
We're going to come back in a moment, but we got to do the E. Give us the E. You got 30 seconds. Then we'll come back and do it again.
The E stands for empty tomb, is that the tomb of Jesus was known. They weren't mistaken about where it was. And on the third day, it was actually empty. All the evidence shows that it was empty.
Okay, I want to hear about that evidence in just a minute.
Yep.
Really glad you're watching The Perspective today. I know you're enjoying the conversation. If you have questions, concerns, maybe a journey in your own heart, you're saying, wow, is Jesus real? Why don't you call the number on the screen, 855-910-6297, or write to me at theperspective.tv, at theperspective.tv. I'm going to be back in a moment with Abdu Murray. Welcome back to The Perspective. Mike Sherbino here with Abdu Murray. We're talking about the case for the resurrection. Okay, Abdu, you just told me what CASE stands for. Let's go. Just give us a quick review, and then we want to talk about especially E.
Sure. So the case stands for the crucifixion, that Jesus died by crucifixion as a historical fact, that his disciples claimed that he appeared to them having risen from the dead, not surviving the tomb, but risen from the dead, that the skeptics, Paul and James, who were staunch enemies of the Christian faith, especially Paul, believed that they had seen him risen from the dead and they changed their minds. And then finally, the E is the empty tomb, that we know where Jesus' tomb was and that it was in fact empty 3 days later.
I think I'm going to preach that next Easter.
Okay, there you go. There you go.
Thank you.
That's all
Maybe I can just condense this part of the video clip.
Yeah.
That's it, folks.
There you go. So we know that the tomb was empty. First of all, we know that it wasn't the wrong tomb. Because someone could say, well, they got the wrong tomb. They went to the tomb. It was empty because no one was in it in the first place. Well, here's how we know that it was the right tomb. The Gospels record that Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, a very well-known person, asked for the body from Pontius Pilate and then put the body in his own family tomb. Now, the reason why Joseph of Arimathea is important is because as a public figure, he is unlikely to be a Christian invention.
I get that. I'm tracking with you.
Yeah, if you were to make up a guy, you'd make up a guy no one knows.
Yeah.
But you made a famous guy up. It would be like saying, my uncle is buried in the tomb of George Washington.
Right.
Like, well, you can verify that it's false.
Yeah.
So why would you make up that lie? So we know where it was. And we know it was empty 3 days later because not only do the Gospels record that it was 3 days later that the tomb was in fact empty, but also that the lie was circulated, the disciples stole the body. The lie presupposes that the tomb was empty. You wouldn't have to make up that lie if the tomb was full. And third, no one produced the body. Not the Jewish authorities, not the Roman authorities said, guys, calm down. This whole resurrection, we got it over here, right here. There you go. Calm down, be done. And the fourth bit of fact, this is pretty cool actually, is that the first witnesses to the resurrection were women.
Okay, and that is a support. That's very important, but tell us why.
Because the women's testimony was worth nothing in the ancient Near East, especially in the first century. If you were going to make up a story and put the first witnesses to the central miracle of your fable, you wouldn't make it women. You'd make it Peter or James or John or even Bartholomew or one of the boys, Nathaniel, someone that no one ever talks about. One of the boys. You wouldn't make it women unless that's exactly how it happened. And so the fact that women saw the tomb empty gives more credibility to the account than if it was men, because women had no credibility. And so that's ironic. And so just interestingly enough, the crucifixion itself is the upending of how we think of victory. Jesus takes sin upon himself, seems defeated, but is actually the one who wins. And Jesus uses the incredible, the non-credible, to become the most credible witnesses possible. The whole thing is just an upending of what we expect.
I love how you title that together. But here's the but. People still reject it. They say, you know what, you're just fabricating all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're putting all that together, and there's lots of other alternatives.
Yeah.
What are some of the common alternative things that get thrown at you.
Yeah, so any alternative explanation has to account for all of the facts, all of the 4 facts I just said. So most of the alternatives will account for 1 or 2, maybe 3 of the 4 facts, but not all 4, not the C, A, S, and the E. So a couple of the alternative facts, for example, one that was popular, I don't know if it was popular, but it was circulated sensationally a while back, was the twin theory, that Jesus had a twin brother who was secret, and that he claimed to be the resurrected Jesus, but his brother was still dead. That one got shot down pretty fast.
Yeah, the nail hole thing, that kind of really blew that theory.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things wrong with that theory. The second one was called the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He just sort of passed out and then sort of revived in the tomb. Somehow his disciples overpowered the temple guard who was in front of the tomb thing, broke the Roman seal, did all this, took this battered and bloodied guy and said, by the way, this is your victorious Messiah. None of it makes any sense, and most people reject that as well, but it's a competing theory. The third one is the hallucination theory. And the hallucination theory is that the disciples saw something, but they all hallucinated it because they so badly wanted their friend, their champion, to be alive, that they hallucinated the whole thing. The problem with that is that hallucinations are almost never shared.
And they didn't really have hallucinating drugs at that time, did they?
Right. And if they did, those guys didn't have the possibility of getting a hold of those things. But 2 is that hallucinations tend not to be shared to this level of detail. Because remember, they not only hallucinated that they saw him risen, but they hallucinated having breakfast with him. A bunch of them did.
Yeah.
Eating, you don't have multi-sensory hallucinations. You either hear or you see. Sometimes you can hear and see, but you almost never hear, see, touch, and taste the hallucination.
Never thought of that.
And they all shared it together. So it's highly unlikely that there was any kind of a mass hallucination of that level of detail across multiple people, and hallucination wouldn't explain why Paul was converted. Paul did not want him raised. Paul wanted him dead and to stay that way. And yet Paul was convinced by hallucination he didn't want. So it doesn't make any sense. So that's why the resurrection is the best explanation for all 4 of these facts: death, appearances, skeptics' chains, and empty tomb. And the only reasonable explanation really is that this man rose from the dead.
We only got a couple of minutes left in this interview, but you're going to be back tomorrow for more. I'm looking forward to that. We're going to take a little different approach. I want you to talk about one of the proofs of the resurrection that you haven't touched on yet, and that's the early church.
Yeah.
And the church today. You got 2 minutes. It's all yours.
In fact, a good friend of mine, Wes Huff, was on Pierce Morgan a while back, and he says one of the best evidences for the resurrection is that we're still talking about it. And I love the way you put that, because it's true that the church was birthed in a hostile political and a hostile religious environment. Hostile religious because of the pagans, but also because there were Jews who opposed this idea of Jesus having risen from the dead because they didn't want him to be the Messiah. But the political issues were pretty tough too. And Christians were being persecuted. Yet there was this fervent belief that he rose from the dead as a fact. Not that his teachings lasted, not that he taught some really good stuff and we ought to believe this hopeful idea that maybe he'll vanquish Rome, but that he actually was the coming Messiah and the Messiah who had come. So he was a fulfillment of both Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering Messiah, but also Messiah ben David, the conquering Messiah, and that he conquered death and will return again one day. So the fact that the early church sprung up amidst all of that is incredibly powerful evidence that something substantive happened.
The diversity of expressions of the church today. You got a minute. Why is all that?
Oh, well, I think that the denominational diversity of expressions, ethnic issues, regional issues, but you notice something. All of them have a center basis on what's called the mere Christianity. The creation of man, the fall of man, the eventual redemption of humanity, and the coming back of Jesus. And in that redemption part is the death and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So despite all the denominational differences, which is just humanity trying to grasp with the ambiguous verses of the Bible. And that's what we're all trying to do, is just grasp with the ambiguous part. But within Christianity, there's this central mere Christianity, which is unshakable and not the kind of thing you can negotiate on. Otherwise, you create a new religion altogether. But the different religions of the world, that is humanity's grasp at trying to attain godhood or trying to have something where we can earn our way to heaven. And in this sense, Jesus is so remarkably unique because he says it's the opposite of what you want. What you want is to justify yourself. I can justify you, but you got to trust me.